Good morning, friends. One of the things I mentioned in Sunday's sermon, sort of in passing, was that divorce exists not only because of the hard-heartedness, the sinfulness of man, but also to protect the innocent ones who are being harmed by that hard-heartedness. Because the truth, as we've seen, is that God does not endorse divorce in any sort of blanket way. In fact, one rendition of Malachi 2, verse 16, states outright that God hates divorce. Now, there is admittedly some debate as if that's the proper translation of the original Hebrew, but even if the commonly accepted alternate translation is accepted, well, that translation indicates that the man who hates his wife and so divorces her brings shame upon himself in doing so. So whichever translation you go with, and it is good to know which one is right and which one is wrong, but in either case, in this scenario, divorce is not put in a good light, particularly when it's sought for those illegitimate reasons. Now, for the sake of argument moving forward, let's go with that full-on statement that God literally does hate divorce, that he allows it in some circumstances, but he really does hate it. Well, if that's the case, then why allow it at all? I mean, if God truly does hate divorce, then that seems like a pretty absolute standard to never get divorced for any reason whatsoever, because God hates it. And yet clearly God does allow divorce in the case of a husband or a wife committing sexual immorality. So why would God permit this exception? Because even if God does hate divorce, even if it is right to state it in those terms, we must be careful not to act as if God can only have one motivation at a time. Because even if God does outright hate divorce, it's also true that God loves justice. And he can do both of these things at the same time. And God's justice is not only about judging the wrongdoer, it's also about protecting the innocent. As one quick example, in God's law in Exodus 23, we read, "You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right." So God clearly cares that the innocent not be oppressed by denying them justice. You are not to make victims of the innocent and the righteous, those who are in the right, seeking the right, and so on. And so this is why God permits the occasion for divorce, even though he does, in fact, hate it and very much look down upon it. When one person in the marriage is being so hard-hearted and sinful as to sin against their spouse through breaking the marriage covenant in their own sexual morality, then not only does that grievously offend the God who created the covenant, it grievously hurts the other person in the marriage. And therefore, out of his sense of justice and love and mercy toward that person, God gives that person a means of escape. When it comes to the sexual immorality of a marriage partner, the truth is you do not need to stay. In this case, divorce is an option. And I stated it kind of forcefully just a moment ago, and so let me restate it perhaps a little bit less so, that yes, perhaps according to the Malachi 2 passage, God hates divorce, but he hates other things more, like innocent people being oppressed. And so divorce is an option. Now, again, I don't believe it's required. I'm pretty convinced that if the offending party is willing to repent and seek forgiveness, turning away from that immorality, then hopefully the marriage can be salvaged. And I would always encourage the couple, if possible, to work through things with counseling, of course, and the help and encouragement and prayer of their church family, so that real forgiveness can take place, that real reconciliation can take place, that real healing can take place, and rebuilding of trust in the power of God. But it is true that if the one partner commits sexual immorality, Jesus himself says it is permissible for the innocent party to initiate divorce, for that marriage covenant to end, and then for the innocent party to be able to remarry. Because God is not at all the tyrant that so many people want to make him out to be. Yes, as we mentioned Sunday, when he gives permission for something, we need to pay attention to his instructions concerning what is and is not actually permission. We can't just call ourselves the innocent victim based on our own standards and then claim we can divorce our spouse for, basically whatever reason we want to do, as if we kind of flip the whole situation around, and now we're abusing God's law on the other side. That would once again be playing the word games that we talked about and we warned ourselves against yesterday. But when it comes right down to it, in this matter, God absolutely does care about the innocent party. And sometimes there can be reconciliation, and we always hope for reconciliation, despite a road that would be full of difficulty and it would be a painful process. But we hope for healing and restoration, and that the marriage could actually be brought to a greater point of strength on the other side of that ordeal. But again, it is entirely legitimate at the same time for the marriage to simply end based on that sexual sin for the sake of the innocent party. And since Jesus himself makes that clear, if the innocent party does pursue divorce in this permitted way, we should not look down on them. We should not shame them for that. I believe it was R.C. Sproul that said, by Christ's own teaching, he does not bind their conscience, therefore neither should we. Now, with that in mind, we can actually go back to Deuteronomy 24 that we talked about yesterday, the regulations concerning divorce, and we can see even there how God cares about protecting the innocent party. Because the scenario there where the man gives his wife a certificate of divorce and sends her out of the house, well, many Christian theologians and scholars believe that, if anything, that's the requirement God is commanding when it comes to those men divorcing their wives in the first place. The warning not to do so frivolously obviously does come later, because you may not be able to get your wife back, for the reasons that we talked about yesterday. But from the get-go, the idea is that God is ordering that if you're going to be so hard-hearted as to divorce your wife for any of these ridiculous reasons, then you at least need to give her a certificate of divorce before you send her away. And we say, well, what's the big deal about that? How does that help anything? Well, just this. In that culture, women were almost entirely reliant upon men for their basic survival. In adolescence, a girl was under the protection and provision of her father until the point where she got married. Then, of course, she was under the protection and provision of her husband. And, of course, then if that husband divorced her, she was now basically out there on her own with no real good source of that protection or provision. As a result, she would likely seek to be remarried more or less as quickly as possible to once again have that protection and provision. And the point of the certificate of divorce was to guarantee that she had the opportunity to do that, because that certificate would be a legal document from her first husband saying that he had divorced her, and so that he was giving up any right that he had to call her his wife or to claim any further authority or influence over her whatsoever. In short, that certificate would give that woman freedom from her husband. And considering the situation at hand, I think it'd be accurate to say that this meant that God was commanding that she have a way to prove her freedom from her abusive husband, that first man. With that certificate in her possession, that man who so frivolously sent her away could no longer make any claim on her. He couldn't try to control her. If she wanted to get married again, that first husband couldn't do anything to stop it. And so that certificate freed her from that abusive man. And so that is one thing that apparently that God did require from these men who were so eager to divorce their wives, to protect those women in their freedom from him. In this way, we see that God offered a way for that woman to be protected from a controlling and spiteful ex-husband, and which would pave the way for her ability to find protection and provision from another man. And I know all of that still sounds so foreign to our ears, steeped in our contemporary culture as we are. Nowadays, the very idea of a woman depending on a man for those basic things is reprehensible to so many people. But really, if you're willing to think about it, and if you're willing to submit to God as the sovereign creator and king, and that he sets the standards, and that all parties involved need to submit themselves to him. Well, first, we admit that yes, sin is a real thing, and that's why God permits these protections. But if you really think about the way God designed things, men and women being together, men being the primary protectors and providers, the woman being that man's helper, his partner, a massive source of his own strength and wisdom, when that actually happens, because both man and woman are submitting themselves to God's will, friends, it works. And it's awesome for both parties. It really is. Again, my wife and I are not perfect, and we are far from sinless. But I can assure you that when you submit to God's purpose for marriage in the roles between men and women, it works, and it's an incredible blessing. It is greater than I ever anticipated that it could be, but it is. But even with that in mind, in any case, we unfortunately do admit that sin exists, and that not everyone does submit to God's design for these things. And so God does provide these protections in these prescribed cases so that the innocent party can be protected and find freedom from their oppressor, because God does not like divorce. Let's at least say that much. And divorce was never God's original intent here. But as much as God may hate divorce, he also hates an oppressor, and he loves justice, and he wants to see that the innocent party can endure and be provided for and find blessing in him and his grace and mercy toward them. We, of course, do need to make sure that each party, each one, does submit to God's will in all of these things. With that, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you soon.